Okay, hi folks. So today's topic is Kantian ethics. As you know, Kantian ethics is one of the 4 theories that you're expected to know about for the ethics course, along with situation ethics, utilitarianism, and natural law. Now, almost always, when I ask students, which is the most difficult of the ethical theories, which is the one that you struggle most to understand, they're going to tell me Kantian ethics, right? Now, I think I agree with that. I think that Kantian ethics is probably the most complex of the 4. But it really is worth making the effort to understand Kant. Not least because, well, an essay specifically about Kantian ethics could come up, and is frankly fairly likely to come up, but also because even if a question specifically about Kant doesn't come up in the exam, it's very helpful to be able to talk about Kant. For example, if you're discussing utilitarianism in an essay about utilitarianism, it's very good to be able to contrast and compare utilitarianism to Kantian ethics, right? And to be able to argue whether one is better than the other or not, right? And also in the context of subjects in applied ethics, such as, I believe it was, sexual ethics in year 13, and then before that in year 12, business ethics, and euthanasia. So it's very good if you're capable of applying Kantian ethics to those issues, right? So I think it is worth looking into Kant and having a good grasp of what Kantian ethics is all about. And before we go into that, it's useful to have a little bit of background information, background knowledge about Kantian ethics. So Kant lived in, well, he was a German philosopher who lived in the 19th century. He's considered to be one of the Enlightenment philosophers. And much of what triggered, if you will, his philosophical thought, including his ethical thought, was the writings of David Hume. Now, you've heard of David Hume, of course. He comes up pretty strongly in the arguments for God's existence, because Hume argues against arguments like the cosmological argument and the teleological argument. And Hume was quite a troubling guy, especially for people like Kant, because Hume had some very controversial things to say, not just about religion, but also about morality. Now, we don't need to go into the details, but the basic idea is that Hume had a very low view of morality. He treated morals as if they were some kind of irrational instinct, right? Maybe some kind of social convention, but the point is, for Hume, morality didn't really have any basis in reality, right? And this contradicted what most other philosophers, and indeed most other people in the world, believed at the time. Probably still the case today. So Hume worried people, and he worried Kant because he viewed morality as ultimately irrational. But surely morality isn't irrational, right? Surely it's rational to say things like murder is wrong, rape is wrong, charity is right, helping the poor is good. Surely those claims aren't irrational. Surely they aren't just, emotional impulses or instincts, right? So a lot of what Kant does is motivated by a desire to answer Hume, right? So what Kant wants to do is he wants to save morality by giving it a rational foundation. So I guess that the first theme here is that, we're going to come back to this, but the first theme here is that for Kant, morality is based on reason. It's not based on emotion, and it's not based on divine revelation. It is ultimately a rational practice. Moral beliefs are ultimately rational beliefs. And the ultimate ground of morality is reason. So this is Kant's answer to Hume. That's why he was so keen on insisting on the importance of reason in morality. So this is probably the most helpful, for your purposes, the most helpful summary of Kantian ethics. It's what he called the categorical imperative, at least one of the formulations of the categorical imperative. It reads like this: always recognize that human individuals are ends and do not use them as means to your end. Right? In other words, actions are good only if they are only if they treat other human beings as ends in themselves and not as means to ends. That's what makes an action good, if it treats someone as an end in itself. Now, what does that even mean? This is what puzzles most people. What does it mean to be an end to treat someone as an end in itself rather than as a means to an end? So, something like this. If you use someone as a means to an end, what you're effectively doing is you're using that person for your own benefit, right? So, an example of this is if you help your friends, say if you help your friends to revise for an exam, but you do it in order to make them like you, right? If you're doing that, then you're not really being moral, according to Kant, right? Your action may be good or may seem good, but at the end of the day, you're just using them for your own benefit because you want them to like you, right? Whereas if you treat somebody as an end in itself, then that's very different because what you're doing here is you're acting out of the will to benefit this person. So in our earlier example, imagine you're helping out your friends, say, to revise for an exam because you want them to do well. You want them to have good marks and you want them to go on whatever university course they've applied for and to have a happy life, right? So if that's why you're helping them, then Kant says that's good, that's morally good, because you are treating them as an end in itself. You aren't using them for your own benefit. You are genuinely motivated by the will to benefit them. So it's all about intentions, right? It's not so much about, it is about the action itself. But at the end of the day, what matters is why you're doing what you're doing. Are you doing it in order to benefit them? Or are you doing it in order to benefit yourself? That's what makes the difference between an action that just seems to be moral and an action that is genuinely moral. Now, in general, when people talk about Kant, and when you first learn about Kant, the first thing you hear about Kant is this, another formulation of the categorical imperative. This whole idea of universalization, I'm sure you've heard of this before. So, there is therefore only one categorical imperative. It is act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Now the first important thing to understand here is that this, although it seems quite different to the other categorical imperative, it actually isn't, or at least for Kant, it isn't supposed to be another categorical imperative. It's supposed to be another way of saying the same thing, right? Now you might think that's a little bit odd. Well, aren't they saying really different things, right? Aren't they quite different formulations? But at least for Kant, they're supposed to express the same thing, right? So let's look at this a little bit more closely. So act only according to that maxim. Maxim is a kind of rule, by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So the idea is you have to act in such a way that you could rationally desire for everybody to act in the same way. It's a bit of a, I guess it's a bit of a fancy, to simplify things, it's a bit of a fancy way of saying act in ways that you would like to be treated, right? And because, if say I start stealing, right, Kant tells me, well, would you want stealing to be a universal maxim? Would you want it to be the case that everybody steals? Well, surely not, right? Because then people would steal from you. And, you apply that test to every action to see if it's a genuinely moral action. Now, once again, you might think, well, this is quite different to what Kant said about means and ends and, treating someone as an end in itself as opposed to treating someone as a means to an end. But again, for Kant, it's supposed to be an expression, a way of saying the same thing. And to be honest, to be fair to Kant, I think there is some substance to that view, right? So, surely, if you follow this, right, then you are going to agree that we should treat people as ends in themselves and not as means to ends, right? Because if I treat you as a means to an end, if I use you to benefit myself, I can't rationally desire for that to be a universal maxim. I can't rationally want everybody to use others as means to ends, because then that would mean that others would use me in order to benefit themselves. And I can't rationally want that. I wouldn't want other people to use me. Therefore, says Kant, I shouldn't use others. So hopefully you can see the connection between the two formulations of the very same categorical imperative. If not, well, that's something you could potentially use as a criticism in an essay about Kant. You could say, well, Kant says that, there's this one categorical imperative, but actually it seems like he's contradicting himself. Seems like there's two. But I would say that they're, if not identical, they express the same fundamental idea. Anyway, so let's leave this to the side. I think the easiest thing to focus on when you're writing an essay about Kant is this, right? I think writing about universalization and universal maxims is more difficult than writing about this. This is probably the clearest expression of Kant's moral theory. So I would say, if you're going to define Kant, especially at the start of your essay, go for this. And then you might want to talk about the other formulation as well. But this should be your priority. If you're going to define Kant, use this. That's my advice, because this is easier to talk about than universalization, and I think it's much clearer. So, let's talk about other theories too. Because, to be honest with you, in any essay on an ethical theory, the examiners will expect you to talk about other theories too. You're not really expected to be an absolute expert on Kant, right? To know the ins and outs of Kant. What you are expected to do, though, or to have rather, is a kind of synoptic or systematic understanding of the different ethical theories, what they say and how to connect to each other, how they resemble each other, and how they disagree with one another, right? If you can show in an essay that you have a good understanding of this, of how Kant relates to other different theories, then you will do well. So let's focus on that. So, utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the opposite of Kant in the sense that it's the theory that everybody finds very easy. And the idea is pretty straightforward. Actions are good if they maximize happiness, if they have good consequences. Then you have varieties of utilitarianism, but the basic idea is the same. It's the consequences that matter. If you're a utilitarian, at the end of the day, it's all about what comes as a result of your actions. Not so much about the action itself, or about the intention behind the action. What makes an action good is if it produces good effects. Now, hopefully by now it'll be clear to you that this radically contradicts Kant. For Kant, it's not about the consequences. It's not this that ultimately matters. What does matter is fulfilling your duty towards others. Remember, you have a duty towards others to treat them as ends in themselves rather than means towards ends. Right? So what matters for morality is that you fulfill your duty towards others and that it is done with the intention of fulfilling your duty. So once again, it's not just about the action itself, it's also about the intention behind the duty, behind the action itself. It's not enough to just perform your duty, it's also, you also have to have the intention of performing your duty. Right? So sharply different here. And so sometimes people say that Kantianism is a deontological theory because it focuses on duty, not on consequences. So utilitarianism is a teleological, I didn't write it here, but you can find it in your textbook. Utilitarianism is a teleological theory because it focuses on the end goal, or rather the consequences of your actions. So sometimes people say Kantianism is deontological, utilitarianism is teleological. Personally, I don't find that very helpful, but it's in the textbook and it'll get you marks. So by all means, write about it if you want. So that's the first difference between Kant and another theory. Here's another one. As I've said before, Kantian ethics is a rationalist theory. Now, when I talked about intentions, right, and saying that what matters is why you do what you do, not so much the consequences of what you do. Some of you might think, well, that sounds very much like situation ethics, right? Because if you think of Joseph Fletcher and situation ethicists, they say that what makes an action good is if it's done out of agape love, right? And by agape love, we mean kind of selfless, sacrificial love. That's what we're talking about. And so situation ethicists like Fletcher are going to say what matters to an action is why you do it, right? Not the consequences that come about as a result of the action. And when I talk about Kant and how he says that you need to treat others as ends in themselves, right? You need to be motivated by the will to help them, not to help yourself, or at least not only yourself. then it sounds like there are strong similarities between situation ethics and Kantian ethics, because they both say that intentions, not consequences, are what matter. However, there is a pretty big difference between situation ethics and Kantian ethics, and that's the stance on reason. Right. So I don't know if you can see it. I have a little picture of the brain right here and the heart over there, and they're going in separate directions. It's a nice little cartoon to help you remember the core difference between situation ethics and Kantian ethics. Because for Kant, again, morality is grounded on reason. You have to be motivated by reason. Moral action is rational action. An action is good if it is done out of a rational understanding that you have a duty towards other fellow human beings. So your brain tells you you have a duty towards others and you need to fulfill it. And so you fulfill the action if you're a rational person. But for Fletcher, it's not so much about the brain as it is about love. And love involves emotions like compassion and empathy, right? So there are differences in emphasis here, right? And it's more than just emphasis, really, because Kant says it can't be about emotions. Moral actions cannot be motivated by emotions. And that excludes pity, by the way. It excludes compassion. It's quite an odd thing. We'll get to that later. But it's quite odd because in our everyday language, in our everyday practice, we think that it's very good to be motivated by pity and compassion. And Fletcher agrees with us. He says, yes, it's very good. In fact, for an action to be good, it has to be motivated by love. But for Kant, that can't be the case. Because morality has to be motivated. Moral actions have to be motivated by reason in order to be genuinely moral. So that's the second difference between Kant and another ethical theory. And lastly, the difference between Kant and natural law, Kantian ethics and natural law. Now, Aquinas and other natural law theorists also think that reason is very important, right? In fact, Aquinas, and you'll learn this year if you haven't done conscience already, Aquinas believed that moral conscience was really reason just making the right decision. So he had a rationalist, or somewhat rationalist, view of morality as well. However, Aquinas, just like any other natural law theorist, ultimately thinks that morality is grounded in the desires of God. Right? So at the end of the day, an action is good if it aligns with God's will. Remember, Aquinas, following from Aristotle, believes that we all have a telos as human beings. Telos means purpose. Right? And we all have a God-given purpose. God has made us to act and behave in certain ways. And to act well is to act according to God's purposes, the telos that He's given us. And the analogy I like to use, or one of the analogies I like to use, is the watch. Right? We say that a watch is good when it correctly tells the time. Okay? And that's because when we design watches, we design them with the purpose that they would tell the time. So a good watch is a watch that fulfills its human-given telos. In the same way, a good human being is a human being that fulfills his or her God-given telos. Right? So morality is ultimately about God's will. With Kant, it's different. Kant's ethical theory is a secular theory. Now, Kant does believe in God's existence. He's not an atheist. That might come as a surprise to some of you. But he definitely does believe in God, although he's not very keen on arguments for God's existence, but he still has faith. He says faith is a very good thing. However, he doesn't think morality should be based on God's will. Right? He thinks morality should be based solely on human reason. Right? At the end of the day, morality is a construct of reason, something that we build using our reason. That's why a lot of people say that Kant's theory is a humanist theory. So I put secular, but humanism is a good way of putting it too. Right? Kantian ethics is a humanist ethics rather than a theological ethical theory, because it's grounded in human reason. At the end of the day, what makes an action moral is if it aligns with human reason, not with God's will. So that's a third difference. And again, it really helps if you're capable of understanding those differences between the different ethical theories, because bringing in different ethical theories to an essay about Kant will make your essay look much better than if you only focus on Kant, I think. And I'm sure your teachers will agree with that too. So let's talk about criticisms, and we'll finish with that. I've got 3 criticisms So one criticism that you often get in the literature and just, popularly, is that Kantian ethics just seems way too impractical. Right? It's not actually useful in the real world. It looks nice on paper, in theory, but in practice it's a disaster. And utilitarians are going to push this line very strongly, because utilitarians pride themselves in having an ethical theory that is suited to the real world. Right? Because if you really live in the real world, then you should think about the long-term consequences. At the end of the day, that's what matters, the long term. So it's much more practical for us to look at the consequences of our actions, rather than the actions themselves or the intentions behind the actions. In the long run, that's all that matters, consequences. Kant doesn't seem to care very much about the consequences of our actions. They don't seem to matter. But, you can put it like this. Think of a prime minister, right, or a president. Would you rather a prime minister that is a utilitarian, so a prime minister that thinks about the long-term benefit of the country, or a prime minister that is a Kantian, right, that's kind of, talks about treating others as ends in themselves and so forth, but doesn't really think about the long-term effects of the policies that he or she will implement. Right? And it seems to me that most people would say, well, the utilitarian option sounds like the more reasonable one. So that's a pretty serious criticism of Kant. However, there are answers. Right? So one thing you can say is that actually Kantians don't need to ignore consequences. They really don't. Because if you really think about it, if you really treat someone as an end in itself, rather than a means to an end, then you're going to think about the long-term benefit of this person, right? You're going to think about how you're going to benefit this person in a way that will be long-lasting. You'll want the best long-term outcomes for them, if you really treat them as ends in themselves. So Kantians don't need to ignore consequences. They just think it's secondary, but it's still important. That's one thing you can say. Another thing you can say is you can turn the tables and say, well, actually, it's not Kantianism that's impractical, it's utilitarianism. Because utilitarianism says it's consequences that matter, right? But it can be very difficult to calculate the consequences, to predict what will come as a result of what we do, right? And the standard example is, you save a baby in the river that's drowning in the river, and that baby turns out to be Hitler or some evil dictator. But you couldn't have known that, obviously, while you were saving the baby. And you wouldn't have time to calculate the consequences anyway, because you just have to save that baby, right? It's very difficult to predict what the consequences of our actions will be. And it's really impractical to expect us to do that all the time, especially when we have to act very quickly, like in the river case, right? So if you want to defend Kantianism, you can turn the objection on its head and say, well, really, the impractical theory is utilitarianism, not Kantianism. Another objection is to say that Kantian ethics is too abstract. And what we mean by that is that Kantian ethics is too detached from reality. It's kind of related to the first objection, really, but it's a little bit different. Because a lot of people are going to say that because Kantian ethics is a rationalist theory, in a way it alienates us. It expects us to be like little robots. Always acting out of reason and not out of emotion. But surely emotions are very important parts of what it means to be human, right? Surely if we all suddenly lost all of our emotions, then the world would be a very sad place, right? Emotions are wonderful things. They are part of what constitutes the richness or the wealth of human experience. So it's a little bit dehumanizing almost to expect us to be rational all the time and to only act out of reason and never out of emotion. So that's an objection that you can expect from situation ethicists, because remember, they say that actions need to be motivated by agape love, and that's not in itself an emotion, but it entails emotions like compassion and empathy and so forth. And so situation ethics are very likely to argue something like this. Kantian ethics is dehumanizing. It doesn't take into account the importance of emotions. But again, as in all cases, there are possible answers. So Kant doesn't say that emotions are always bad. He just says that we shouldn't rely on them for our moral decisions. So I don't think Kant ever says that we should never have emotions. He just says they're not very reliable guides when it comes to moral decisions. Moral decisions are very serious, right? They're about what's the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do, and we should leave emotions out of that. That doesn't mean that we can't, have rich emotional experiences, have friendships which involve lots of positive emotional experiences, be very happy when we watch a great movie at the cinema, and that sort of thing. So Kant doesn't exclude emotions altogether. He just says that when it comes to moral decisions, emotions shouldn't be involved. Another thing you could say, which is what Kant said himself actually, is that although it might seem like a good thing to act out of pity and compassion, at the end of the day, it's a selfish thing. It's not selfless at all. That might sound strange to you, but think of it like this. If you're walking down the road and you see a beggar on the street, you might feel bad, right? You might feel pity. And then you might go and buy a sandwich and give it to that beggar. And then you'll feel better about yourself. Kant says it might seem like you've done a good thing, but really you just acted out of your own selfish desire to feel better. Because you think about it, you felt bad at the start. And now that you've helped the beggar, you feel better, right? So what you've really done is you've treated the beggar as a means to feel better about yourself, right? You haven't treated the beggar as an end in itself at all. You treated the beggar as a means to an end. In this case, the end is to feel better, right? So you really acted in such a way as to benefit yourself, not to benefit another person. So Kant argues that acting out of pity is not moral at all, it's really selfish. That's a very controversial thing to say, but Kant said it himself, and it would be a very interesting thing to talk about in essay. Finally, you could argue that Kantian ethics is just too demanding. It's asking for too much. It's very difficult to act selflessly, to treat other people as ends in themselves. It's hard, because we're naturally selfish. Evolutionary biologists will tell you this. We have sort of inbuilt selfish impulses, right, that are there because they help their ancestors to survive and reproduce. The point is, we have very deeply entrenched selfish instincts, right? Instincts of self-preservation. And to expect us to act in order to benefit others all the time is asking for too much, right? It's, again, you could argue it's dehumanizing. It places very heavy burdens on us that we aren't capable of bearing realistically. So, again, possible answers here. Kant believes that we have free will, right? He believes very strongly that we have free will, in fact, that we are capable of governing our own actions. And that would imply that we are capable of resisting our selfish urges, even if we have those selfish urges. So in other words, Kant will tell you to just be tough, right? And resist those urges. Yes, it's true that they're there, but that doesn't mean you have to listen to them. You have to abide by them. And another objection is to say, well, actually, Kant doesn't say we should never act in our own self-interest, right? That would be a very foolish thing to say. I mean, when I get up in the morning and go grab breakfast, I'm technically acting in my own self-interest. But surely that's not a bad thing to do.